Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. We're continuing our series on Prophetic Voices of the First Testament. I'm going to read the first 14 verses of 1Kings 19. When Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah: "May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them." Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, travelling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. But the Lord said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah replied, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." "Go out and stand before me on this mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied again, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." Excuse me. Well, the events on Mount Carmel provided dramatic evidence of the supremacy of the Lord, leading the people to acknowledge that the Lord alone is God. We might have expected that there would be a sweeping revival across the land as people abandoned Baal and returned to covenant faithfulness, worshipping the Lord. Such a revival would be the crowning achievement of Elijah's ministry. Instead, in the face of a death threat from Queen Jezebel, Elijah, allegedly in fear of his life, ran away to another country far out of her reach. Far from the triumphant prophet, Elijah comes across as a person in deep despair, and so he seems to want to resign his prophetic ministry and even ask God to kill him. It's not exactly what you would call a Hollywood ending, but it does powerfully illustrate the truth of John Stott's comment that the occupational hazard of Christian discipleship and ministry is discouragement. Most biblical scholars and preachers tread a very well-worn path of interpretation and exposition when speaking about these verses. As a result, the text has become very one-dimensional, as if it can only mean one thing. It has become boxed in by the predetermined assumptions of scholars and preachers alike. The standard interpretation of these verses tends to focus on Elijah's apparent fear of Jezebel and his failure to trust God. It's typified by this comment from A.W. Pink that Elijah had been sustained by faith's vision of the living God, but now he lost sight of the Lord and saw only a furious woman. It is Elijah's apparent slide into despair that seems to fascinate commentators and preachers alike. But then we are always fascinated by the weaknesses and failures of others, especially if they are a celebrity like the prophet of God who challenged Baal and won. Of course, one of the reasons that we're so fascinated by other people's feelings is that someone else's feelings tends to make us feel a little bit better about our own. But I can't help but wondering if there's more to this text than just the apparent despairing spiritual failure of a mighty man of God. And I think if we dig a little deeper, we might find a very different story here in these pages. The first thing we should note from the text is that when King Ahab reached Jezreel, instead of telling Jezebel what the Lord had done on Mount Carmel, he told her all that Elijah had done. And that's odd because it was God and not Elijah who had answered by fire. To be fair, it was Elijah who had prayed for God to answer and who had commanded the execution of the priests of Baal, an act that would certainly have enraged Jezebel. The Lord had clearly shown Ahab that he alone was God. He gave Ahab the opportunity to repent from his sin and worship the Lord, and the opportunity to be guided by his prophet. It seems that Ahab has rejected that offer of grace, and he had no doubt been impressed by what had happened, but he remained unchanged by it. Instead of taking a stand for the Lord, when faced with Jezebel, he passively yields to her desire for revenge. But actually, it's unlikely that Jezebel would have intended to really kill Elijah. This was really just a threat to do so. If a king or queen was going to have someone killed, they would just give the order. What they wouldn't do is warn their intended victim first and tell them that they were going to kill them. In fact, there was a good reason for Jezebel not to kill Elijah, for there was every chance that had she done so, she would have made him a martyr, causing even more opposition against her and Baal. It may also have increased support for the Lord now that the people had acknowledged that the Lord alone was God. It is more likely, therefore, that she just wanted Elijah out of the way, for with the prophet gone, there was every chance that this so-called revival might be stalled. Strangely enough, Elijah obliges her by running away to Beersheba, well out of her reach. But contrary to the majority of opinion, I don't think he ran away out of fear. He was certainly not afraid of death, for he asked God to take his life. Though it's likely that if he's going to die, he doesn't want it to be at the hand of Jezebel, for that might imply that Baal had in fact won at the end of the day. So I think there's more going on here than simply a despairing prophet running away in fear. For example, there is the journey itself. Beersheba was well out of Jezebel's reach. Elijah was perfectly safe there. But he left his servant there and continued alone for another day's journey into the desert, and from there he went to Mount Horeb, another name for Mount Sinai, some 200 miles south of Beersheba. If all Elijah wanted to do was get away from Jezebel, there was no need for the journey into the desert or to Mount Horeb. The extent of the journey suggests a plan rather than panic. Furthermore, in verses 5 and 8, when Elijah was in the desert, the angel of the Lord fed him because the journey was too great to go without sustenance. That seems to suggest that the angel of the Lord is anticipating the trip to Mount Horeb, which suggests that this journey, as I say, is all part of the Lord's plan. We should also not miss the fact that the meal that the angel made for Elijah was the same meal that he was given by the widow of Zarephath. This is the Lord reminding Elijah of the sustaining power of his presence. One of the main problems with this passage centres on a verb at the beginning of verse 3, which most modern translations, not all but most, have as Elijah was afraid. The problem is that in the vast majority of Hebrew manuscripts of this text, another verb is used, which is translated as then he saw or when he saw. Only a few Hebrew manuscripts read to fear or be afraid, but the majority of English versions use the latter manuscripts, hence the translation that Elijah was afraid. And so from this we have this well-worn path of Elijah's fear, flight, and failure. However, the translators of English versions have assumed that the verb he saw is a mistake in those other manuscripts. But what if it's not a mistake? What if it's the fear is the mistake? The fact is that the verb he saw fits the overall context of the passage very well. As Davis writes, we must remember chapter 18, where Yahweh in living colour and on turf known to be sacred to Baal had publicly and irrefutably shown Baal to be the non-God that he was. By both fire and rain, Yahweh had proven he was the only real God, and the people had confessed as much. Ahab, of course, told Jezebel all about this and about Elijah's execution of the prophets of Baal. Then Jezebel sent her death threat to Elijah. Hence, Elijah saw that in despite of all that happened on Carmel, nothing was going to change in Israel. Jezebel was still calling the shots. Jezebel was given all the facts like Ahab. And the Lord had answered by fire and rain, and he was proven to be the one true God. But she refused to change her position on the basis of those facts. One of the most famous sayings in the Bible is Pilate's reply to Jesus in John 18, "What is truth?" And it's somewhat ironic that the phrase encapsulates one of the biggest problems in many societies today. We no longer know what is true and what is not, despite the fact that we live in an information-rich age. In President Trump's first term, his press secretary made a statement that was demonstrably, provably false, and a journalist challenged him on it. And so presidential advisor Kellyanne Conway stepped forward and defended the press secretary, saying that he had been giving alternative facts. The reporter responded by saying that alternative facts are not facts, they're falsehoods. Years later, the reporter's reply now seems hopelessly naive. Everyone today has their preferred media outlet that tells a version of the truth that they want to believe, even when the facts contradict what is being reported. I'm old enough to remember the Manic Street Preachers' 1998 album, This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours. But the title of that album is the very world in which we are now living in. Everybody has their own truth, and they're all true, even if those things are contradictory. Everything is true if you believe that it is true. And so, of course, nothing is true. Many Christians have bought into the ideas of the Enlightenment that human reason is enough to change humanity, and so much of our evangelism is geared towards getting the truth across to people. We think that if we have rigorous, sound arguments for the faith, then people will be persuaded. It is a well-intentioned but misguided approach. One thing this passage teaches us is that even when people are confronted by the truth, it doesn't mean that their mind or heart will be changed. Jezebel's response is a vivid demonstration of the fact that the truth of the human heart, a truth that Jesus reminds us of in John 3 verse 19. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light. In verse 9, the Lord asks the question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he repeats that question in verse 13. Taken at face value, the question appears to imply a criticism of Elijah, a point seized on by those who favour the fear, flight, failure interpretation of the text. The suggestion is that here the Lord is rebuking Elijah for his fear, for his failure, and the inappropriateness of his present location. But as we shall hopefully see, Elijah's location is critically important to understanding the meaning of the text. I think that God's question to Elijah is not so much a rebuke as it is an invitation for him to speak. For the Lord surely knew why he was there, and in fact appears to have led him there. God's question then is a question of tender kindness, intended to relieve the full burdened heart of the prophet, that he might be moved to reveal his desire to pour out his whole heart before the Lord. As such, this text then reveals God's heart towards his desponding servants. If the Lord was angry with Elijah, then why did he lovingly, caringly provide much needed food for him in the desert, food that was a reminder of his earlier care and provision? God's question to Elijah then is an invitation to state the case against Israel, and in so doing to unburden his own soul. God's question is both covenantal and pastoral. This is further highlighted by verses 15 to 18, where God appears to show his agreement with Elijah's charge against Israel. And with all this in mind, the traditional interpretation of this text makes less sense. For God's response is not one of judgment and rebuke, but one of tender-hearted kindness and care. It's a response that invites his broken-hearted servants to come to him, to unburden their hearts to him. And Elijah's presence on Mount Horeb is highly significant. For this is the mountain where the Lord also revealed himself to Moses, possibly at the very same cave entrance that Elijah was now at. It was here that the covenant was both given by God and broken by the people. Even the length of time it took Elijah to reach the mountain, 40 days and 40 nights, is significant, for that was also the time of Israel's unfaithfulness and also of Moses' intercession for them. The implication of this is that Elijah's trip to Mount Horeb was significant in the redemptive history of Israel, for his visit parallels that of Moses before him, suggesting that he's here for reasons relating to the covenant rather than simply running away in fear and failure. This is further emphasized by Elijah's complaint in verse 10 and verse 14. Verse 10 is often taken as the complaint of a despairing prophet who's failed in his ministry. But it might also be that Elijah is simply telling the truth. What he's saying here is that he's brokenhearted for God's sake. In fact, the Hebrew text underscores this by placing the emphasis in the direct objects, especially your altars, your prophets. Elijah's brokenheartedness then is not because of any failure in his ministry or fear in his heart. It is because despite all that the Lord has done for his people, there are those who still reject him as the true and living God. Seen in that light, it sounds like Elijah is charging Israel with apostasy rather than crying over a failed ministry. As such, verses 13 and 14 constitute a formal charge against Israel, so that the Lord's question to Elijah, "Why are you here?" it becomes then not only an opportunity to unburden his heart, but also an invitation to present his charges as the prosecutor in the case against Israel. So, far from running away from his ministry, Elijah's flight to Horeb brings a conclusion to his ministry, with him bringing formal charges against Israel for breaking God's covenant. What follows in verses 15 to 18 is nothing less than God's agreement with those charges against Israel and his promise to bring judgment against Israel under the terms of the covenant. Rather than condemn Elijah for his apparent failure, God agrees with his diagnosis of the situation. In this regard, this text challenges believers today to be brokenhearted about the things that break the heart of God. If we are to be despondent about anything, should it not be for God's sake? Shouldn't we be despondent about the fact that his covenant is broken, that even his own people treat his holiness lightly, sin so easily, and are more concerned with their own lives than with God's glory? God has done so much. He has revealed himself in the person of his son, Jesus. Yet people reject him today as sure as they did in the first century. Our hearts ought to be broken by that. Our hearts ought to be broken by the fact that people are going to an eternity in hell rejecting Jesus. I don't know much, but I know this. It breaks the heart of the Father. And what breaks the heart of the Father ought to break ours. I mean, the only reason for not praying for the lost is because we are content that they're lost. Maybe it's the fault of preachers, for the subject of hell and judgment are rarely preached on these days. Maybe we ought to give them more attention, if only to reawaken in us the desire to rescue people from it. Like Elijah, we must come before God and allow him to touch our lives in such a way that his concerns become our concerns, that his will and glory becomes our desire. Thanks for listening.